Okay, I was recently involved in putting together this book, Inside Rural Ireland, Power and Change since Independence. So I had clearly a good chance to mull over the issue. And as some of you know, power has been discussed forever in the social sciences. But the occasion here was in some years ago, the archives of Muintir, which was a community development organisation or movement really that began way back in the 1930s. The archive was donated to the university in Galway, and it was a conference held to celebrate this event, and it's out of that conference that this book emerged. So just in relation to the sort of themes that came up, the one section on the West, another on this movement I mentioned, women and patriarchal power has its own section. And under intellectuals, basically there were sort of Catholic writers in journals and fiction writers. And then there's a section on let's say, the countryside since 2000. So my own chapter was basically looking at Muintir and some farmer movements in the interwar period that spilled into the 1950s, and looking in particular at the leadership of the priest who founded Muintir, Father John Hayes, and two leaders of these farmer movements. So basically these, as you can imagine, had a great deal of dealings with the state. So the state, obviously, in all of these discussions, looms very large. And, you know, if you scroll ahead, the EU comes into it in a big way subsequently. But if you ask one question to start with, which is, where does power reside? Is it inside or outside? So in this case, let's say the clergy, the Catholic clergy, and the farmers, you could say, were the big groups inside. And on the outside, you have the new state, particularly the ruling politicians. And in the background as well, you had the fact that Ireland, let's say in the early independence years, in the 20s and 30s, was decolonising as well as being economically dependent on England. So, and of course England was the mother of the Industrial Revolution, so you had essentially linkages between an agrarian society after partition, in that partition effectively changed the whole landscape in the state insofar as the industrial areas were in the north and the south was heavily agrarian. So the question is then, if you look at the inside and the outside, the clergy, the farmers, the new state, against this broader backdrop, the question is, well, who had the power? How was it used? How did they relate to each other? Did they complement each other? Did they compete? And the likes. So in looking at this more broadly, we can talk in the Irish case of a number of revolutionary changes or transitions. So the first one has to do with the power of the clergy. And obviously, for centuries, Ireland was recognised as a Catholic country. But there's no doubt about it that in the late 19th century, you get this so-called devotional revolution, in that the institutional presence of the church greatly increased with church building, the number of clergy, and as well as that, you get a very committed body and very large body of the faithful. So if you look at mass attendance and look at other Catholic rituals, there's a huge increase. The term itself is derived from a famous article written by an American historian, Emmett Larkin. The agrarian revolution involved the transfer of land ownership from the landlord to tenant. And as well as that, there's another element which spills into the 20th century, the redistribution of land, which was very prominent here in the West because the land was very frequently poor and the farms were too small to be considered economic. And interestingly as well, the English had started this with the Congested Districts Board in the 1890s. And very significantly, this board was shut down in 1923. At least it was absorbed into the Land Commission. And the The section on the west has a very good article on this question, looking at the language dimension by one of the Galway historians, Varley. So, the nationalist revolution had its origins to some extent in the agrarian revolution, in that the land war was led by nationalists. And you have the constitutional side of it, the Home Rule movement, and then you get separatist nationalism, which finally culminates in the War of Independence. Well, in 1916, the War of Independence, and the whole thing takes you could say, a disastrous turn with the Civil War, which happened between 22 and 23. This had a very important formative influence on the political system, in that you get pro-treaty parties and anti-treaty parties. The treaty was essentially the agreement with England that introduced dominion status within the British Empire, which was extremely contentious. And it was around this, this was one of the major issues around which the Civil War was fought. And the Industrial Revolution, obviously, like I say, relationships with England were crucial. There was the colonial element, there was the economic element, and in addition you get this ideological idea that increasingly modern society is composed of one leading element, which is urban industrialism. So urbanisation, you could say the idea that to be modern you had to be urban, became increasingly prominent. Right, so the question for us then is, if we take this as the broad backdrop, the question is, well, how was this power mobilised in two areas which are, you could say, fairly perennial in these debates about rural development? One is civic activity, and the other is state intervention. So for the civic activity, I'm going to look at Muintir, seeing that I've been looking at it a bit, and this in some ways summarises, you could say, the linkage between Muintir and the state. The figure in the centre is Éamon de Valera, who was the leader of the Fianna Fáil anti-treaty party that came to power in 1932, and that dominated politics right through the 20th century. The figure here on the closest one here is Father John Hayes, who was, as I say, the founder of Muintir. And the other is, this was a get-together, but I'll say a few more words about these get-togethers in a moment. So, if we look at the background, essentially the background, you could say, was the post-war economic crisis. This is the post-World War I economic crisis, the slump that happened in the 20s and the Great Depression subsequently. So conditions were extremely bad, and they didn't improve for long. In other words, it was a long, drawn-out period of depression. And Father Hayes was a young activist priest, and he gathered around him basically younger priests, the curates, and he had some support from the bishops as well, but not all of them. But the Bishop of Galway, well, in the 1930s, Michael Brown was a big backer of the movement. Interestingly, John Hayes himself was fearful that the movement would become too clericalist. But there's no doubt about it that the clergy was the backbone in terms of the leadership. National teachers were also very, very important, and these in many ways were controlled by the church in the Irish case. So after a sort of a false start in the early 1930s, Muintir emerges in 1937 as a community movement built around the Catholic parishes. And the basic aim, you could say, was what you might call a rural renewal. But this was seen in some ways, certainly by John Hayes, as a means to an end, which was effectively to renew the Irish nation after the Civil War. And there was a lot of class conflict during the revolutionary period. So the idea as well was to build bridges, particularly between farmers and farm labourers. So it was integrationist in these senses. As regards the organisation, as I said, the Catholic parishes were the central unit, and these were organised in what were known as guilds. which involved the whole population who were willing to join. And then you had these parish councils, which were sort of small representative groups that would represent the guild. The guild was split into vocational sections or corporate sections. So in the early days there were three major ones: farmers, rural labourers and others, such as women, for instance, farm women. And in order to ensure a sort of a civic, democratic culture, the idea was that you would give each section equal representation on these parish councils. It was strictly non-political as well. They tried to keep politics out, for the reason being that these civil war tensions were extremely intense and a great deal of what you might call intimidation still. If you look at the 1933 general election, for instance, it's recognised that it was probably the most, in terms of physical violence, the worst ever. Father Hayes' idea as well was that over time, given the fact that you would have these parish councils and these guilds becoming active, and you would build up this civic culture, and this would take the sharp edges off social differences and economic differences. But the idea wasn't effectively to restructure property or the ownership of property, even though Father Hayes himself very much took the side of the small man. His background was that he came from a family that had been evicted during the 1880s. So this was a great theme, essentially, that the farmers had emerged out of the struggle, and he was extremely anti, even though he had served in Liverpool, but he believed essentially that colonialism had been a disaster in Ireland, and that effectively what British rule was revolved around was what he called the extermination of the Irish. So what you get then are two elements in terms of the activities. Basically you have local improvements. This was before the term community development was invented. And the other thing was you get the building of a national movement. So you have these annual get-togethers, like in the case of the photograph. And as well as that, they produced a whole range of publications. And these, for instance, Rural Ireland and the Landmark, these have been digitised and are available from the archive in Galway. Interestingly as well, they were extremely media savvy for the time, and they used, for instance, these annual get-togethers, the rural weeks, to publicise the movement and to spread it to new parts of the country. They were very much, Hayes himself was particularly appalled at emigration, and he saw protectionism under Fianna Fáil as an attempt to build a new economy behind tariff walls with rural industries and the like. Now there was a tension here insofar as many of the farmers were involved in export agriculture, and in the 1930s this was really a very hot topic, as you can see, during the economic war. The other thing that Father Hayes was involved in at the national level was this Commission on Vocational Organisation. There was a big, after this papal encyclical of 1931, Quadragesimo Anno, there was a sort of a big Catholic social movement, a renewal of it in Ireland. And eventually a commission was set up under De Valera, or during De Valera's time in office. And it proposed a very ambitious plan that the Muintir approach based on these guilds, that it become the basis of a means of rebuilding a new rural civil society around the Catholic parishes. So this was a major undertaking, and it published its report in 1944. So what about the advances? Well, just to say a few words, there was a huge amount achieved at local level, and at national level the movement got very involved in the rural electrification scheme, and then subsequently in the 60s in the campaign for piped water. There's a really good description of this in Mark Tierney's book, The Story of Muintir. Now, as well as that, there were a series of challenges. It grew fairly slowly. So, for instance, by the end of the 40s, there were only 90 guilds. Subsequently, the number increased greatly with rural electrification. And generally, the whole tactical idea was to build collaborative relationships both within localities and between Muintir and the state. So, good relations with ruling politicians, such as you can see in the photograph. De Valera attended most, or not most, but certainly he was a regular attender at these rural weeks. Now, critically, in 1944, the state rejected the proposal of the Commission on Vocational Organisation to put Muintir at the centre of this new reorganisation of rural civic society. And this was basically, I think, a major setback, and it prefigured subsequent setbacks, where you could say Muintir depended on the state, and the state retreated or let it down as a result of short-termism and the like. Now, there were other developments as well, you could say, that went against the grain as far as Muintir was concerned. The farmers in the 1940s and 50s began to organise independently into, you get a young farmers movement, you get two new farmer movements, culminating in the National Farmers Association in 1955. And they were fairly suspicious and sceptical of the whole Muintir approach. The whole idea was that it was too diffuse. It wasn't sufficiently specialised to be of use to farmers. At local level, even though the normative idea was to overcome or to transcend class divisions, and to build this shared democratic civic culture along sort of equalitarian lines. The biggest study we have, which is in the 1950s, dates from the 1950s in East Limerick, suggests that there was a great deal of tension between the farmers and the labourers, and in many ways it was simply reproduced within the local parish councils. So in other words, the normative ideal was one thing, but the reality on the ground, certainly on the basis of this account, the two effectively were going in different directions. There was also a difficulty in attracting women as active members, in that many women, it seems, didn't feel represented within Muintir, that the movement was too masculine, as it was put, or as it was said. And the ICA, in particular, the Irish Country Women's Association, basically argued that they were, no more than the farmers, more specialised on women's issues, and that Muintir's approach was too diffuse. Now, just to basically say what happened subsequently, John Hayes died in 1957, just at the time when the international community development movement was gathering pace internationally. And Muintir basically immediately sees the opportunity with community development, and agriculture and the emphasis on agriculture fades out. In the 1960s, Muintir again goes to the state with a very elaborate programme of having Muintir as the National Rural Development Organisation, working in partnership with the state. But ultimately, after a great deal of wrangling, Muintir is disappointed again. This, no more than the 1940s, is another major setback. Now, in the 1970s, when the Common Market or the European communities come into it, the EEC, there's a pilot programme with paid organisers for 3 years, but this is not renewed, and you get a pattern of basically Muintir declining, following the funding, and in the, let's say for the last 20, 25 years, you get the emphasis on community alert and text alert, but these local councils suffer as a result, in that what you get is more specialised groups, and these general community-wide groups suffer. So they find themselves increasingly being placed in the shade. So what can we say? Well, you could argue, I think, that the state essentially had the power ultimately in eclipsing Muintir. Now, it's a lot more complicated, but as a generalisation, you have to obviously introduce a whole bunch of qualifications, but at the same time I think there's a certain amount of validity to such a generalisation. Right, if we turn then to look at state intervention, certainly in the early years, and particularly with partition, and as I say, you have this agrarian economy, and you have powerful elements in the church, in the state, and among the organised farmers who wanted to keep the mainstay of the economy in agriculture. And again, there are interesting echoes here with, let's say, how farmers respond to rural development subsequently. In other words, they see it as fine as long as it's agriculture-centred. But if it's autonomous and if it's going in other directions, they're immediately suspicious. So the whole idea was, you could say, a bit utopian, but the idea was that you could build a modern society along agrarian lines. In other words, a rural and agricultural modern society. So what passed for rural development, you could say, in the early decades of native rule was, the context was free trade under the first government, which the second governments, which were pro-treaty. These were Common Gael, subsequently Fine Gael. And the emphasis was on increasing the efficiency of export agriculture and on land reform, this land redistribution, which was a bit contentious within the farmers, because the big farmers reckoned that they would lose land and that agriculture would become less efficient if this redistributive land reform was pushed too far. So it subsequently, certainly in these farmer movements, it was always potentially a very divisive issue. Now, a big change happens in the 1930s when De Valera's party, Fianna Fáil, takes over and you get protectionism and import substituting industrialisation. And as well as that, Fianna Fáil is officially committed to rural industrialisation, even though this meant not in the countryside so much as in the big towns. And there were certain advances made from a very low level. The war, obviously, threw the thing out of kilter. And in the 1950s, you get a major crisis. So Mary Daly has reviewed this period in a book, which is still a great source, The Slow Failure of Population Decline in Independent Ireland. And this is what she says. Essentially, it's a modernisation view. She was saying that the policies that were followed couldn't provide for couldn't meet the needs of modern people in terms of income, leisure, and all the rest of it. And consequently, it couldn't stop it. These policies were actually undermining so-called traditional rural Ireland. In other words, the people, particularly in the 50s, when you get massive immigration approaching the levels last experienced in the 1880s, you could say that the whole project was being robbed of its legitimacy. Right, so the question becomes then, from the 1960s, how there's a change of direction, and instead of import substituting industrialisation, you turn to the export-led variety and introducing foreign capital increasingly into it. Increasing urbanisation happens, speeds up over time. Now, the question is, well, how empowering was all of this for the rural areas? And there's two different interpretations you can point to. The pragmatic one, which is Mary Daly has continued this in subsequent writings, and she's an article in this book I mentioned. The critical interpretation is a really good book, which of course needs updating, as you can see. It's nearly 30 years old, edited by these individuals, and another book, Ethel Crowley's book, Land Matters, Power Struggles in Rural Ireland, which take a different view from, if you like, the optimistic modernising view. So if we look at this for a minute, in terms of, let's say, the different dimensions, the modernisation view essentially is that economic growth is fairly evenly spread, whereas the critical view points to regional imbalance. And the Dennis Kelly's account before the break, I think, really says a lot about the critical view here. Mary Daly would point out that in the last 20, 30 years, the population has increased, whereas the critical view would say, well, you have to look at this more minutely. You have to see that in some areas the rural population has has continued to decline. So, in other words, you have to be more specific. So what about the farmers? Well, here, the modernisation view put forward by the likes of Mary Daly is that under the Common Agricultural Policy of the European Union, the farmers did very well, as did rural Ireland. And you get what she describes and the others have described as an agricultural welfare state, effectively the subsidies, the market protections, etc. So it's a very optimistic view. The critical view is that this has to be balanced against it. Well, basically what has happened is that some farmers have done really well, but a great number of them have done very poorly, and in fact have disappeared entirely. So, and particularly in the West, you could say the smallholder population has suffered greatly. There's a very interesting question about the power of the representational power of farmers here, in that the Irish Farmers Association, the old NFA, it became an extremely powerful lobby with inside the European Union once Ireland joined in 1973. But there is an argument, Echo Crowley makes this very strongly in her book, that it's big pharma controlled, and increasingly in recent times it represents the interests of the highly commercial dairy farmers. And another feature of them is, to go back to an earlier point, is that the farmers have tended, you can see this clearly, to resist weakening the link between agriculture and the rural, with rural development. And as I say, they're happy with it as long as agriculture is at the centre. But once agriculture effectively is degraded or downgraded, they find it unacceptable. As regards women, the pragmatic, optimistic view essentially is that paid work for women has really made all the difference in terms of the challenge to patriarchy, and that women have modernised a lot quicker than men in many ways. You can see this on and off the farms. They've adopted urban lifestyles. The whole infrastructure, you could say, has improved the prospects for equality, such as the new roads, even though Dennis Kelly's argument here is quite interesting in relation to the roads infrastructure. And let's say car ownership, the huge increase in car ownership since the 70s, so has effectively opened up new opportunities for women and lifestyles, and modern lifestyles. The other thing obviously in the background here is the state equality legislation and EU equality legislation. So for instance, if you look at something like equal pay in the 70s, extremely important. So this was the infrastructure for it. The critical view suggests that patriarchy still lives, particularly on the land, and in one absolutely crucial respect, in that land ownership is still heavily concentrated in male hands. So the traditional bedrock of patriarchy is still intact, is the critical view here. As regards youth and the young, education here is obviously central. And in 1968 you get free secondary education. The state provides this, and then you get the regional technical colleges coming into being in the 1970s. So this makes a huge difference for the likes of Mary Daly. In other words, the young in the rural areas can avail of this education. The critical view points to the rural exodus, to the brain drain and all of this. Finally, in relation to service provision, the optimistic view of Daly emphasises electricity in terms of service provision, the huge modernising effect of rural electrification and piped water in the 60s and 70s. Whereas the critical view points to the planning system, the housing crisis, the centralisation of health services, the disappearance of rural shops, the banking service, policing, the list goes on. And Daly would accept that most recently things have sort of the balance of the interdependence and the optimistic view of urban-rural relations has sort of become a little more unbalanced, in fact quite a bit. And here she points to the ecological crisis, to environmental regulation, extremely contentious. You can see this in the local elections and in the recent European elections. The question of runoff housing in the countryside and the difficulties with planning, a huge issue and a very contentious one. And she also points out very clearly that if you look at industrialisation most recently, it has tended to be focused much more on the big cities, particularly if you look at the IT industries and financial services. So what can we say in general based on this, this bit of a tour? I think in general what you can say at one level certainly is that nationalist power got the better of clerical power and of farmer power early on, and to some extent later on as well. And what you can say as well is that there is a continuity here, but there's also a huge discontinuity in some ways as well. And you can see this after the 1960s, clerical power greatly diminishes. So for instance, by the 1970s, at the national level, the clerical presence in Muintir was really disappearing, even though at local level it still was quite prominent. It didn't disappear overnight by any manner of means. But you can see in the long run the trend is clear. The question of farmers is quite an interesting one in terms of their power. But you could say in some ways as well the shift is against them insofar as the numbers have reduced and they're faced with all these crisis conditions I mentioned. So the other point I would make is that in looking at these questions, you cannot avoid the competition between interpretations or perspectives. In other words, it's not just transitions or it's not just power, it's how these are read and how they're interpreted. And what I think I've tried to show is that you get two very different views, in fact, in many ways going in totally different directions, if you look at the pragmatic view and if you look at this critical view. So, shin shin. Thank you.